Welcome to our webinar entitled Guardians of the Sea, Fisher Perception on MPAs in the Philippines. My name is Caitlin Spurge, the Seafood Resources Knauss Fellow at the National Sea Grant Office and a member of the Lunch and Learn Committee. I would like to introduce our speaker, Sara Marriott. Sara is a 2023 Knauss Fellow and serves as the Great Lakes Specialist at the United States Geographical Survey, or USGS. Sara recently earned her Ph.D. in coastal science from the University of Southern Mississippi. Her research is focused on using interdisciplinary approaches to work closely with stakeholders to build sustainable fisheries that support both ecosystem health and fisherman livelihood. Please welcome Sara.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. And Mary, also thank you for your presentation. It definitely sets us up, I think, for success for this one as well. There's a lot of overlap. So today I'm going to be talking about one of my dissertation chapters, and I'm first going to give a broad overview about what my goals were throughout my research and then dive deeper into this one topic of perceptions of marine protected areas by fishers in the Philippines. And so my overall objective was using an interdisciplinary mixed methods approach was to investigate interactions between different social and ecological subsystems of community-based managed coastal fisheries to evaluate their function and identify gaps in their design. And I just want everybody to take a pause, think about overfishing, and generally what we imagine are these large industrial commercial fishing vessels or purse seines, trawls, scooping out, fish out of the ocean by the thousands. And however, I'm going to talk today about small scale fishing, and calling it small makes the issue of this fishing seem trivial. However, there are over 37 million small-scale fishers, and together they do have an impact on the ocean, and we need to figure out a way to manage them. And so the problem with small-scale fishing is that it's very dispersed and diverse, and it makes it hard to manage with typical top-down tools that we may be more familiar with, such as quotas, permits, gear restrictions, total allowable catch. And fishers are often catching a variety of species, and landing sites could be as formal as a dock or as informal as the beach in front of their house. And small-scale fishing makes up a large portion of catch in many regions, especially in the Philippines, but typically goes underregulated or unreported. And understanding how to manage these small-scale fishing fishers is important to addressing sustainable fishing globally. So this has led to a variety of initiatives to protect and rebuild fisheries using area-based management, community-based management, or a combination of both. And so area-based management, like marine reserves, do not require these complex quota or permitting systems. And as everyone here probably understands or knows, marine reserves support fish production or fisheries through two ways, either through spillover when adult fish move out of the reserve into a fished area, or through larval export where fish spawn and larvae are exported out of a marine reserve into other areas. And there are many different kinds of marine reserves, but the most stringent are these no-take MPAs, where there are no extractive practices such as fishing allowed. And while they are celebrated for conservation, they're not necessarily a silver bullet when it comes to fisheries, and they can also be hard to enforce. And one issue with MPAs is that they're really only as good as they are complied with or enforced. And enforcing marine reserves can be costly or difficult to monitor 24/7. However, allowing communities to manage the reserves has been shown in some cases to create these normative behaviors and increase compliance of the reserves. Another consideration is that reefs have this intimate relationship with mangrove habitat, and mangroves provide critical nursery habitat for many of the fish that inhabit the reef that are being caught. And these fish depend on this nursery at larval and juvenile stages, and then migrate onto the reef for their adult life through this process called ontogenetic migration. And in many cases, only the adult reef habitat is under protection and not juvenile or nursery habitat. So it leads to these questions about how marine reserves can be effective if only part of the fish's life history is protected. My whole research project is situated within Ostrom's social ecological systems framework. And this framework breaks a system down into these 4 subsystems: resource management, resource system, resource units, governance, and users. And I'm very interested in the interactions between the subsystems and what areas could be vulnerable and which practices can be expanded in the future to protect fishery resources. However, today I'm only going to be focusing on the governance and users portion of this social ecological system, looking at perceptions and norms. Overall, my dissertation research was at these 20 different sites of the Philippines. They're all affiliated with RARE, which is an international NGO, and they implemented community-based management at 20 different municipalities shown on this map during their Fish Forever program. And each of these sites has a no-take marine reserve. And overall in the Philippines, there are over 1,400 MPAs, and they've had them since the 1970s. And that said, they've only been found to be 10 to 30% managed effectively, rated by their own MPA management goals. And so the Philippines needs a method for effective management because 50% of their marine capture is from small-scale fisheries. And through this Fish Forever program, the Philippines fishery campaigns employed local community members as leaders. They brought mascots, slogans, events to really bring the community together to celebrate their pride of fishermen and the pride for their important fishery resources. And they did all of this as part of their theory of behavior change to address these knowledge gaps, facilitate interpersonal communication, improve conservation attitudes, remove barriers to change, ultimately all to change behaviors to result in a positive conservation outcome. Their goal was to implement their theory of change model to increase fish abundance for both the benefit of the ecosystem and conservation and fishers. In one of my previously published chapters, I looked at how community-based management impacted fish communities and biodiversity. And I found that in both of these cases, it varied across sites. So I was really curious as to why MPAs were working in some sites and not others. What were the differences between them? Was it a social reason or an ecological reason? And so for here, I'm looking more into the social reasons. And as mentioned earlier, compliance and enforcement are a large part of success in MPAs. And we can get a proxy of that by studying the perceptions of these two topics by fishers. And in some cases, perceptions of compliance of peers may be reflective of actual compliance, but also perceptions are important to study because they can impact the level of community buy-in or support for regulations. So for this part of my research, my question was, what are the differences in fisher perceptions of the marine reserve, catch, compliance, and enforcement between ecologically successful and unsuccessful community-based managed reserves? In that previous paper, I looked at how biodiversity changed before and after community-based management was implemented. And I chose 4 sites to study based on if biodiversity increased after community-based management was implemented, which I defined as successful, or decreased or was unchanged, which I defined as unsuccessful. Recognizing that no change or no difference could also technically be a successful outcome in some cases. So due to a variety of reasons that were the last few years, I was only able to go to these 4 locations out of my original 20 sites. And they're all located relatively near each other. I conducted 37 semi-structured interviews with a target population being adults who were involved in the fishing community, and it included fishers, protected area rangers, local NGO representatives, and government officials. These interviews lasted about 15 minutes and were conducted in English with the help of a translator. I used a combination of deductive and inductive thematic analysis, meaning that I went in with some overarching themes I wanted to ask about, so that would be the deductive side, but also learn some emergent themes from the data, inductive. And I went into these interviews with the intention to learn about perceptions of the marine reserves, compliance, enforcement, and community engagement. And my themes ended up being marine reserve effectiveness, catch trends, compliance, knowledge and education, external challenges, and respect and trust in the Bante Dagat, who are those protected area rangers. And in this chart, I also include how each of these themes were characterized at each type of site. And I'm going to go into quotes for each of my themes as well and describe them a little bit more comprehensively. At all of my sites, regardless if the fishers viewed their catch as declining or increasing, fishers viewed the marine reserves as helpful. They intimately understood the potential ecological benefits of MPAs, saying that the marine sanctuary is a big help because once it has been protected by fishermen, fishermen are the ones who are benefited when fish are bigger and go to the outside. Some also spoke about spillover very directly, and that these MPAs can serve as a spawning ground for fish. Additionally, fishers and community members believed that people complied with the rules, at least those within their own community. So if only asked about compliance, are the rules generally followed, for example, they would simply respond with, everyone follows the rules. Such as this one fisher who said, here in Tayasan, fishers follow the rules, regulations, and policies about fishing management and law in Tayasan. However, when asked or probed a little bit more, if they had ever witnessed violations, many participants said that they had, but that primarily these violations were coming from people outside of the community. Similar to those outside fishers being the primary violators, if there were negative perceptions about fish catch, for example, they thought it was declining. Many of the reasons for that decline were due to reasons external to the community. So a major cause of concern was the recent typhoon, less recent now, but recent at the time that I was there. So Typhoon Odette, which made a direct hit to the communities I was interviewing in, and it had caused mass devastation, both in terms of human lives lost and ecosystems. It was the equivalent to a Category 5 hurricane and is the second most costly typhoon ever to hit the Philippines. The community members I spoke with felt the typhoon had devastated their reefs and caused the fish to disappear, which had caused them a lot of stress. After Typhoon Odette, the coral reef was devastated. Big corals were washed out onto the shore, and there was a lot of damage to the marine sanctuary. In addition to the typhoon, other factors they felt impacted the fisheries were garbage, other types of pollution like nutrient pollution, climate change, and political corruption. And that political corruption piece also is a overfishing piece where in this region where I was studying, there's no commercial fishing allowed. However, some politicians or people high up in the government have commercial fishing vessels and tend to slide under the radar when fishing in that area. And through all of these interviews, something that stood out to me was the respect and trust for the Bantay Dagat. These are those marine protected area rangers, which literally translates to guardians of the sea. Most Bantay Dagat are fishers who volunteer to guard. They sometimes receive a small stipend for their work, ranging from $5 to $60 per month. And they're the main enforcers. They have shifts so that in some areas there is 24/7 enforcement of the marine reserve boundaries, but that isn't the case everywhere. And fishers and community members really believe that since the Bantay Dagat have been around, there have been fewer violators, and their continued presence is enough to dissuade or prevent future violations. For example, as long as there is Bantay Dagat to enforce the violators and intruders of municipal waters, violators do not have time to catch fish in this area. This respect for the Bantay Dagat creates social norms that empower the local community to effectively enforce their own municipal waters and marine reserve boundaries. So what about differences between these two? At successful sites, one of the biggest differences that I found was how knowledge transfer was perceived. And at successful sites, they viewed knowledge as sufficient. And having the knowledge about the rules and why MPAs are important is the reason why people followed them. This Bantay Dagat said many fishermen didn't know that the MPA was beneficial to them, but later on, they have lots of information that the sanctuary is good for them, and it's a big help. Additionally, some participants at successful sites spoke about how Bantay Dagat would also inform violators what the rules were as part of a first warning for violating the MPAs. While at unsuccessful sites, fishers perceived violations were occurring from people, either local or transient, who did not know the regulations. This fisher said, those violators are those fishermen who do not know the rules or regulations. Most of them are teenagers or young ones. This indicated that there was a need for further information campaigns or education more broadly within the communities and more cooperation with outside communities. So overall, people associated with the fishery that I interviewed had these very positive perceptions of the MPA and believed that it was a benefit to them as fishers and to the town. And while they perceived compliance as high and perceptions can reflect that reality, they also did mention witnessing violations occurring. And as mentioned repeatedly now, those MPAs are really only as good as they are complied with or enforced. And that biggest difference amongst my successful and unsuccessful sites was that perception of knowledge. And there are two different types of communication pathways that were discussed. First, we have this formal communication pathway from local government and NGOs to fishers through sanctioned workshops or events. And this is pretty easily tracked. At all of my sites, they had the same types of events led by RARE, the NGO, partnered with all the local governments. They have, when asked how regulations were communicated with the fishers or with the community, people said that we have town hall meetings and everybody goes to the town hall meetings, except that maybe not everybody does go. And then we also have these informal communication pathways. So that would be communication between fishers or between fishers and Matadagat or between Matadagat and illegal fishers. Remembering that sometimes as part of a first warning, those Matadagat were actually giving education and information to the illegal fishers. So there might not always be this effective peer-to-peer communication among other fishers, including illegal fishers. Typically, strong fisher social networks generally include groups of fishers that use the same gear or fish for the same species. And because small-scale fisheries are so diverse in gear and species caught, it is possible that at some of these sites, there may be groups getting the information who don't overlap with groups not getting that type of information. So interpersonal communication can increase compliance and create these normative behaviors. And if this information transfer is a potential key to success or a key to increased compliance of an MPA, integrating social network analysis either into ecological models or as a part of program design prior to implementing community-based management will have the ability to fully anticipate potential challenges to compliance. And that way, a program can be designed to address informal communication from the start. And then finally, increasing formal collaboration with communities beyond the coast could increase knowledge of rules and the benefits of MPAs and potentially reduce violations occurring from those considered outsiders. And so with that, I talk kind of fast. So thank you, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. Audience, we're going to take, we can take up to 8 minutes actually for your questions. And before we start answering them, I want to encourage you to share Sarah's presentation with anyone who might have missed the event today by telling them about the recording, which will be available in just a few hours at the NOAA Central Library YouTube channel. And I'm about to send you that link now in case you missed it earlier. Let's wait for questions, but I did have one that was just, I'm curious about how you were introduced to the community and how, and whether there was any shy people or reasons that some people did not want to talk and answer your questions.
Yeah, so there's definitely a little bit in bias of the people that I ended up speaking with. RARE's been in these communities for almost at least 15 years now. And all the people associated with RARE are local community members as well. And so there's quite a process of getting approval to interview community members. So you have to, write a letter to the mayor, they have to approve, and then you get introduced to the community members through my liaisons through RARE. So that does provide this sort of self-selection bias of people who want to participate.
Excellent. Thank you for answering that question. I was curious. We've gotten a couple of questions while you're answering. This first one is also a compliment. Great presentation. You used diversity as a metric to determine the successfulness of an MPA. Do the communities similarly care about fish diversity, or does another community metric such as abundance matter more?
Yeah, that is a great question. I don't know if the community members themselves care about fish diversity. However, it is important because they do catch a diverse number of species. They're not necessarily catching one type of species. So having this diverse ecosystem does help them in the long run in terms of their livelihoods.
Excellent, thank you. This next question says, great presentation, Sara. I'm thinking about social networks. Do you know of any fishing cooperatives in the region you studied?
So, cooperatives. They're yes and no. So the fishing cooperatives aren't as defined or structured as I think that they might be here, but they are starting to do so. On my last slide, I have something called Batman Alliance. So that is actually this alliance between these 4 different regions to make sure that all of their local rules and regulations are aligned so that they all have the same regulations so that not one is having an advantage over the other. And that way it is somewhat like a cooperative, but it did seem like there was still room for improvement in terms of communication. And then on the other side of that, there are all these inland municipalities that it seems like there's no communication with. And those also seem to be the source of a lot of people coming down from the hills or the mountains and going and fishing and not really knowing what the rules are.
Thank you. This next question asks, how overfished were the areas before the reserved areas were implemented?
I don't know if I can answer that question. I know fish catch had been declining for a long time. A lot of these marine reserves have been implemented for a long time as well. Some of them have been implemented since the 80s, but a lot of them functioned as a paper park prior to about 2014 when they implemented this community-based management. So it was really what I was interested in was how the community management part of it impacted the effectiveness of that marine reserve. And so I don't know like how overfished they were, but I do know that abundance had increased after community-based management was implemented.
Excellent. Next question says, Sara, did you gather information on whether interviewees identified as part of an Indigenous group? And if so, did you identify any differences in opinions between those people and others who had been in their locations about 2 generations? I ask because when doing interviews with fishers in Palawan on dugong presence, we found very different responses because of the different cultural history of the interaction with those animals.
That is a great question. I did not ask if people identified as Indigenous. That is definitely something to think about and look into.
Yeah, it's an interesting comment, actually.
Mm-hmm.
This next question says, hi, Dr. Marriott, great presentation. Considering your time in the Philippines and work with the fishers, do you have any thoughts or recommendations on what do you think is the best path to combat IUU fishing in the Philippines? As a large, small-scale fishing nation, do you think there is a best path forward on incentivizing the populace on better stewardship, or is it a community-by-community effort? What successes have you seen?
So I think that there's a couple different efforts that are going on right now in the Philippines, and that I think is pretty translatable across many different countries. And that is one of the efforts that I'm not involved with, but I know that's happening, is a fish tracking app. So a lot of the fishers now have an app that they can take pictures of their catch. That way it can be identified. It helps them manage their finances a little bit. And it also can be better monitored and recorded, and then also goes into the reported realm instead of unreported. So that's one thing that's happening, and that can be expanded across different countries. The other thing is that the Philippines has a really rich history with their natural resources, and prior to Spanish colonization, so Spain colonized the Philippines for about 400 years before the US was colonized it for about, I think, 50 years after that. And so prior to all of that, the Philippines was very much a community-oriented fishery. They used a lot of these same practices before all that. And then when Spain and the US came in, they tried to implement a lot of these top-down management situations. And due to all these various, I can't remember how many different languages there are in the Philippines, but it's a lot. They have a lot of different languages. Each island has their own unique culture. And so it just didn't work very well to have these top-down management tools. So since about the 70s and formally introduced in the 90s into their fisheries code, they have formalized community-based management. So every municipality has the authority to create these community plans and manage their own fisheries. And I think that is something that maybe won't work everywhere, but I think really does work in the Philippines, and with the right initiatives and communication or education, they can really take ownership of their own local reefs and do a good job of stewarding them. Not sure if I fully answered your question, and I kind of rambled.
Someone said there are many languages in the Philippines, so many.
So many.
Two more questions. I'm sorry, there's 2 more questions. Well, just to wrap it up after that, this first one says, did you have any policy recommendations coming out of your findings?
So I don't know if this is a policy finding, but that social network piece I think is so important to understand how people communicate with one another. And if they're sort of, when Mary was talking about ecological connectivity, understanding how humans are part of the ecosystem and are integrated into anything in terms of 30 by 30, I don't think that we can achieve any of that without really understanding the human piece. So really not underestimating the importance of how humans are part of these ecosystems, I think is really important for policy going forward.
I agree. This is our last question. Were the communities you interviewed engaged with RARE's social marketing or other conservation programs?
Can you repeat that?
Sure, I'm sorry. Were the communities that you interviewed engaged with RARE's social marketing or others conservation programs?
Yeah, so they were all engaged with RARE's social marketing campaigns.
Thank you, Sara.